So let's begin. So today we will be discussing what is in making paper flowers. Is it easier to cut by hand or use a cutting machine? So I've come across this question or topic numerous times because, for example, when I do in-person classes, most of my students have this notion that when you're making projects like this, paper flowers, it would be easier to use a cutting machine. However, for paper flower makers, they say that it's actually easier to use scissors and just cut by hand. So for myself, this is my stand. So I've been making paper flowers since 2017. And in my experience, so this would be my answer. It will depend on your application. I mean, what I mean is, it will depend on what kind of paper flower you are going to make. So, for example, if you are going to make a large paper flower like this, so for example, if you're gonna make a wall like me, so I'm going to have a paper flower wall at an event this Saturday, and I need numerous large paper flowers that have simple petals. Then the answer is it's easier to cut your petals by hand. So why? Because when you're doing that, you can cut multiple sheets of paper at a time. So for example, for myself, I usually cut 4 pieces at a time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the top one, and then I cut it at the same time. So that is easier because if you are going to use a cutting machine, you use a cutting mat and then you feed it one at a time. So that kind of takes time. So this is much easier, most especially for, again, as I've mentioned, if your petal is just simple and again, large. And then if you are going to use a cutting machine, most especially to those who have cutting machines, the stickiness of your mat can go over time, or your mat can lose its stickiness, and then that when it's not sticky anymore, it can be problematic because when it cuts, it can be all over the place, and you have more tendency to waste your paper. So most especially if you're using an expensive paper, that can be problematic. And another pro in cutting by hand is, for example, if you are using a cutting machine, then you need to be beside your cutting machine. Most especially if you're cutting just a simple pattern that takes seconds. But again, if you are cutting for a wall in which you need a lot of petals, then that would really take time. And again, you need to be beside your cutting machine all the time. If you, for example, I myself, when I need to cut a number of petals, I can just be here in the living room beside Sophie, my daughter, when she's watching or playing, and I don't have to be beside my cutting machine. So that's a simple example. But if you want to be, for example, near your daughter all the time, then it's a pro for me. Now, those are the pros of cutting by hand. And later, after I've detailed when do we use a cutting machine, so after that I'll be sharing a trick in which you can cut the cutting process time. So I'll be sharing that later. So now the question, when is it advisable to use a cutting machine? So number one, for me, so this is from my experience. So for example, this is my own design, and it is not advisable if you are going to make a flower that has intricate cuts. Then it is not advisable to cut it by hand, because honestly, you cannot cut multiple sheets at a time with this. I do not advise using scissors. You usually use a cutter And like if you want to do, if you have the patience, you use a cutter to cut intricate cuts like this. So I do advise, if you have a cutting machine, then go ahead and use it when you're making flowers as intricate as this. Second is, if you are, so another flower example. So with this, I do use the paper crafting technique called scoring, in which your blade would be like lightly cutting the paper and then you can easily fold it. So with this, honestly, I used Cameo Silhouette because compared to because I only have the Cricut Explorer 2, and then with that you can only use the scoring pen. You have to have a maker if you want to be able to use the scoring blade, I believe. Anyhow, I do see some makers, they cut the petals first and then they do add the scoring by hand. I do find that counterproductive, because if you can use your cutting machine to do the scoring, then utilize your cutting machine. So I do utilize my cutting machine in making the scores for the petal, such as this. So this is my Nikki sunflower template. Third one is if you are going to make smaller flowers. So for example, for this flower, the rosebud, the petals are this size. And if you are going to cut it by hand, it will take you forever. So if you have access to a cutting machine, use a cutting machine. Most especially, for example, this one, it's so small. So this is where a cutting machine is advisable to use. Then, next one is if you are going to cut an expensive, or if you are going to use expensive paper such as this. So this is an example of a 12 by 12 cardstock. This is from Joann's. I do love it when they have their sale of like 10 pieces for $2. So that's a bargain. However, compared to the paper that, for example, this white one that you can buy in bulk for like $10, so 250 to 320 sheets for like $7 to $10. This becomes expensive compared to like the bulk one. So since this is relatively expensive, I want to use each and every corner of the paper. So for example, this one. Ta-da! Isn't that so satisfying? So for example, I placed in some filler patterns like on the side because I can use those. And with that one, or with this patterns, for example, I can produce a rose and also, for example, a bookmark, even like sometimes a carnation as well. And since I do markets, I sell this usually like $12 a piece. This is $8. So, I can use that for like byproducts and I'm not wasting anything. Yeah, if you're gonna cut like expensive paper such as this, then I suggest like utilizing those small spaces for like fillers. Okay, so also I want to discuss when I cut using scissors, for example, I do not cut professionally. I mean, sides or like the edges are kind of jagged. And if you are making or producing, for example, flowers that you will be delivering or you will be sending like just like small numbers, for example. Let's just say you are going to make a nursery set. So those are like 8 pieces. And for example, the mother is going to like see each individual. I do suggest using a cutting machine for that. It's just more professionally cut, if that's the case. But for example, like myself, I'm going to do a paper flower wall with lots of paper flowers, like 100. So first, I would be saving time if I'm going to cut by hand. Second, if you are looking at like 100 hundreds of paper flowers at a time, you can really tell whether it's like a hand cut or like it's cut by a cutting machine. Right now, I'm going to share my trick when cutting. If you have any questions, go ahead and send them. I am going to answer them right after I've shared my trick. When I tried my hand at like, you know, tracing and then, or like cutting by hand, because I just love using my cutting machine. And when I use, and how do you say that? So when I was contemplating, is it really faster if I cut by hand? Because it's like, what's the cutting machine for? It's supposed to help me, right? And then, okay, I've tried it. And then the process is, for example, when you buy a template online, so you have a PDF file, right? And then you print it, and then you cut it, and then you trace it. You have your template, and then like you outline it, and then you trace it, and then you cut it. What I realized is the tracing part is a process by itself. So I realized, why don't I just print, like I will lay it out and then I print the patterns, the layout directly to the paper that I'm going to use. So for example, this one or this one. And I will just like get like this, for example, and just go ahead and cut it. And that eliminates the tracing part. And that like gives me more time. So, Dini, I don't have the capacity to lay it out on a computer. Simple. So, okay, so there will be like an additional step that like you are going to trace it, but you will just do it once per layout. So what I advise doing is, okay, so this is your template, lay it out. So for example, this is the paper that I've laid out my templates in. So trace, trace, trace. And then I assume since you were able to like print it and cut it, so you have your like your template, you scan it. And then when you have that scan, you can then photocopy it directly, or you can print it directly to the paper that you are going to use. So that's my tip. Again, or it will save you lots of time because it eliminates the part where you need to trace it. Yeah, so that's my tip. So, and also the good thing with that is you can, or you will be able to multitask, because for example, when you print it, you can cut the first batches that you were able to print already. So for example, I'm talking here and I'm cutting. I can print some of the sheets, like for example, over at the other room while I'm cutting. So compared to when you're using a cutting machine, like you can't really multitask. Like you're multitasking there is the process where you like feed your cutting machine. Like even though you're using like 3 to 4 cutting machines, you know, it's still a process wherein like you're feeding them, removing them, and like, hey, cutting machines are not really cheap, so like I can't expect you to have like 3 to 4 cutting machines. I only have 2. And that's kind of a lot already. So yeah, I do hope that you find that tip valuable or useful. So thank you so much for joining. If you have any other questions, you can directly message me. Again, thank you so much, guys. Have a great week. Have a great Monday. Okay, bye.